Okay, let us continue now. I would like to ask from Professor William Bahnfleth to take the stand, please. He will present his topic, Vehicles, Energy and Air Quality, Current Impact and Issues. Dr. Bahnfleth is Professor of Architectural Engineering at Penn State University, University Park in the USA. He holds BS, MS and PhD degrees in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Illinois and is a registered professional engineer. He's a fellow of FASHRAE, ASHRAE, and ISIAQ. Dr. Bahnfleth was president of FASHRAE in 2013-2014 and is an ASHRAE distinguished lecturer. Please,
Professor. Thank you very much. I have to start with a disclaimer that transportation is not actually what I would consider one of my fields, but I do whatever the Hellenic chapter asks me to do, and they ask me to say a few words on this track of the program as well, and so I am giving you essentially my report on what I've learned in the last few months, reading a few pertinent articles. Now, I understood the importance of this, and that was one of the reasons that I supported the chapter in starting the transport conference. So what I'm going to give you are I think, some high-level ideas from an outsider that maybe connect with what the experts are saying, and so I chose this title, Vehicles, Energy and Air Quality, Current Impact and Issues, because I think it's important to understand why we should be talking about this in a conference that is put on by an organization basically of people who do building HVAC systems. So why should ASHRAE be involved in a conference on transportation? First of all, many of the modes of transport that could be considered here are also simply mobile indoor environments. So to the extent that what we do is focused on producing indoor conditions that are appropriate for the occupants or some process, then it's the same thing, vehicles, ships, aircraft. Another important factor is that the transportation is a major energy consumption sector, and it's used in large part to move people from one stationary built environment to another. So there's a connection between buildings and modes of transport, at least on the land. We go from our home to our office to the store, and that process is something that is important in terms of how much energy is being used. It's linked to urban design. In fact, I see that there's a paper on the program that has to do with optimizing design. Another factor is that, again, land-based transportation contributes a lot to outdoor air pollution, which then becomes indoor air pollution when we use ventilation to condition buildings. So there's a coupling there between what is my primary interest, indoor air quality, and the energy use characteristics of vehicles. And the final point I could note is that if vehicles are going to be using more renewable energy in the future, which we certainly expect, renewable electricity, then they're going to impact building design and also grid management. So in a way, my talk on thermal storage a few minutes ago is related to this one by the connection between battery storage in cars and the need to manage the electric grid. So there are lots of interesting connections here that could be explored. And so, the place to start is to note that powered transport is an essential part of modern life, even powered transport using somewhat older power plants. But automobiles, trucks, buses, trains, airplanes, and ships are all important. They're involved in things like personal transportation, commerce, moving freight, and it can be over short distances or long distances. So how much energy does transportation consume in the big picture? The International Energy Agency estimates 36% of the total for all forms of transport. I should note that when they say transport, some sources of data also include moving things through pipelines, so not just vehicles. And note that passenger cars are the largest single contributor there. So if it's 36%, that means that the transport is of the same general magnitude as our buildings, which are around 40% in many regions. And then over on the right, we see a bar chart that shows how that energy use is broken up. This is from the US Energy Information Agency, which uses our archaic units of quadrillion BTU. Fortunately, this is one of the cases when there's an almost equivalent SI unit. So one quad is about 1.05 exajoules for those who prefer SI units. But the thing to notice here is the preponderant effect of light-duty vehicles on the total energy consumption. So it's light trucks and the personal vehicles that people drive around that are contributing most of the energy consumption, and also a lot of the other things that come with it. And one thing that we may be looking at in a more sustainable future is shifting how much of the transport is done by one means or another. Because most of these vehicles today are using fossil fuels, then there's certainly an important impact on climate change, and this slide shows some of the information that's provided by IPCC on the contribution of vehicles to CO2 emissions. And again, you see it's a pretty large slice of the pie there that is associated with transport, 14% over on the left-hand side here. And this figure shows the predicted greenhouse gas generation associated with different types of transportation. And again, the big blue layer on the top there is road vehicles. So that seems to be, from the point of view of climate change, the thing that we need to focus on, although there are other contributors as well. You notice the coastal shipping down there, and the domestic waterborne near the bottom is not insignificant, but smaller. Vehicles not only produce climate change gases, they produce a lot of what are regulated serious air pollutants. So it varies with fuel which ones they produce and how much. I've listed a few of the main ones here, but I looked at the US Environmental Protection Agency's list of vehicle-generated pollutants that are registered, and it was over 400 if you want to track them all down. The particulate matter is certainly one of the most concerning. Some volatile organic compounds. Another major one is nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and sulfur dioxide. And on the right-hand side, we see a chart that indicates the degree of compliance with standards for a number of European countries that were surveyed. And in 1995, the non-compliant PM percentage was almost 90%, and by 2010, that had only been reduced to about 70%. So this is a very significant concern. You see that others that are associated, that can be removed by things like catalytic conversion, nitrogen oxides, benzene, ozone, are much smaller. We're doing a better job, but the PM remains. So what are the health impacts of all of these things? They're severe. Respiratory irritation at the low end, and serious fatal chronic respiratory disease at the other. Some of the things that we've mentioned here are carcinogens, and there are other kinds of systemic diseases that may be caused as well. Some of the things that PM contributes to, we're finding, include ischemic heart disease. So some of the major killers are really being exacerbated in urban areas by this automotive pollution. I'm told that's a picture of Beirut. It was sunnier there the day that I visited a few years ago. Vehicles in urban areas are one of the most significant contributors to particulate matter, which we've already noted is a special problem. It varies widely from place to place, but I've seen estimates that start down around 20% of the PM and go as high as maybe 60 or 70%. The figure on the right here, no, the other right, the left, shows the estimated excess mortality due to PM 2.5, particles smaller than 2.5 micrometers in Europe over a period from 1990 to 2015. And while great progress has been made, we're still estimating 400,000 in 2015. The global burden of PM 2.5 related deaths is over 7 million per year, of which about 4 million is estimated to be outdoor, 4 million indoor, and when you combine them and take out overlaps, you get about 7 million total. On the right-hand side here, we see an example from the World Health Organization of how PM may vary in an urban environment, and you notice the big peaks in the morning and afternoon associated with rush hours, where there's a very large increase in PM for a short period of time while there's high traffic on the roads. And this raises another issue, which is proximity to roadways is a significant risk factor. There's a lot of data now on the exposures as they relate to your distance from highways, and here's just one example on the left-hand side of nitrogen dioxide exposure by distance from roadway in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and you see there's slightly different functions as you go east or west because of the wind, I would assume, but there's a doubling or more of concentration as you get near the roadway. So what that means is that we're getting a lot of exposure for pedestrians and people who work at ground level along roadways, and also for the occupants of vehicles. So this is a very big concern. And again, on the right, we see PM 10 and 2.5 at sites based on whether you're near the road or not. So the big blue bars on the right hand of all of these three, these are near roadways, and the others show background, urban and regional. Urban is in between the regional average and the near roadway value. So something else to consider in planning. So those are problems. That's hopefully an indication of how bad things are. What can we do? There's a whole spectrum of things that can be done to improve this scenario. One is low emission zones, which is an administrative control that may not be ideal, but it does work, and it seems to be growing in popularity. More efficient vehicles, of course, less energy use means fewer pollutants, less greenhouse gas generation, cleaner fuel, shifting away efficiency may or may not improve, but we have cleaner fuels. Electric vehicles are cleaner yet, although they don't necessarily solve the problem completely. What they do is they push the generation of pollution outside of the urban area so that the exposures are likely to be lower. Electric vehicles with renewable energy would be even better, and moving to mass transit and clean mass transit is another step forward. And when that doesn't work, we have to protect ourselves in buildings with air cleaning technology and in vehicles with air cleaning technology that may not be used as extensively as it should be now. And the final factor that can be considered is how do we design cities, and how does that affect the amount of driving that's necessary and the resulting pollutant source strength and exposures from that. So low emission zones are regions in cities where vehicles that don't comply with regulations are prohibited. These tend to target PM 2.5, NO2, and ozone. And the map on the right shows that there are quite a few cities in Europe that have implemented or are implementing that sort of driving restriction. These sorts of things are done also for purposes of traffic control, congestion control. So they fit into that realm. So electric vehicles, as I said, would help us in one way by moving pollution away from cities. Another way that they could help is that they are a distributed source of energy storage, and that's something that's been given quite a bit of consideration already. What if we had a lot of electric vehicles? How could we use that to help manage the grid? And the figures here illustrate the difference between unmanaged charging, where everyone goes home at night and charges their vehicle, and a more rationally controlled charging strategy, which might be part of a smart grid strategy that would actually use that to help the whole power production grid work more effectively. Of course, another way to look at this would be, what would we do if we were trying to harvest as much renewable energy as possible? Then we might want to be charging during the middle of the day when there's a lot of solar. The potential for electric vehicles is growing greatly as the amount of production of renewable electricity increases, and these figures illustrate, I think, pretty dramatically what we've done in the last few years with increases in photovoltaic and wind production. They're going up quite rapidly and are going to be the predominant source of power in some regions if they haven't already become that within a few years. And we've gotten to the point in the US where some places like California have so much solar power generation that it's creating problems for grid management. We had problems in Northern Europe with lots of wind power production where the price goes negative because you have to find someone to take it off your hands to keep the grid balanced. So that's really one of the biggest issues these days, is how are we going to use all this stuff we can produce, and electric vehicles, finding loads, new loads, would actually be a partial solution to that. So again, just to drive that point home a little bit farther, the charging station now becomes a part of your building. It's something that's considered in the design of the building so that that can be integrated with the same green grid, smart grid concepts that are being applied to other things like your washer and dryer and other appliances that will manage power in the future. So what about mass transit? Mass transit has a lot of potential to improve the picture with respect to both energy use and pollutant generation. The figure on the left here is a very interesting one. It shows the megajoules per passenger kilometer for different types of transport. And notice passenger cars, which account for most of the passenger KM, have about 4 times the energy use per passenger of a bus. So one of the things we should be doing with urbanization is to try to have good mass transit systems that people will use and leave their cars at home, or better yet, just get rid of them. My daughter lives in New York and she doesn't own a car because why would you? They're more of a problem than a convenience there. She takes a bus when she comes home. On the right is a figure that takes in a couple of things that we were talking about here. One is the benefits of mass transit, but what this is showing is buses going from more conventional diesel fuel to more clean, renewable sources, and we see here that there's a big potential to reduce the climate change gas production of these as we go to cleaner fuels, and that would also apply to some of the other air contaminants as well. Note that electric batteries and hydrogen fuel cells also have energy costs associated with them. They're just incurred at a different place than the gas we put into a car. Urban design, I think, is a really exciting opportunity for improving the way that transport works for us. A lot of cities have put effort into making themselves friendly to pedestrians and to cyclists. People like to talk about Denmark, where 30 or 40% of the populace rides a bike to work sometime during the week. That's not because the Danes have a bicycle riding gene, it's because for decades it was promoted, and they have, I say this as a cyclist, they have the best system of bicycle paths I've ever seen anywhere in the world, and they make it easy to take your bus on, or your bike on a bus or a train. How is this important? Look over here on the right-hand side, urban density and transport-related energy consumption. So here are a bunch of European cities here where the density is roughly 25 to 75 inhabitants per hectare. That's pretty good. Moscow's better. Hong Kong, where we may have the highest population density in the world. You don't see many personal cars there. People use the mass transit a lot. Australia with its wide open spaces is higher. Here's the United States up here, Houston, Texas. I drove 100 miles one night going to dinner in Dallas, Fort Worth. The people are just used to driving all the time. So this is another thing to consider, is the concentrating population, maybe not on the scale of megacities, but at least locally is a good idea. And you'll find, if you look through the literature, there are discussions of this, that there are optimal densities and city sizes to minimize the pollutant exposures and the energy use. Urban pollution, to make another point here more related to my direct interest, makes indoor air quality control more difficult, because the main way we try to control indoor air quality is to take outside air and replace air from inside the building on the belief that that will be better because it's removing contaminants that are generated indoors. And when you have high levels of PM 2.5 and ozone and nitrogen compounds in that outdoor air, that may not be true. So we need to be looking at other ways to protect occupants of buildings from indoor contaminants than bringing in outdoor air if it's going to be polluted. And certainly if we're building near roadways where we know, as you saw in the earlier data, that there's a problem with proximity, we can design buildings to minimize the exposure to that air as well. So to summarize, transportation, one of the three big energy users. When you put buildings and transportation together, we're talking about 70–80% of the total, possibly in some places. Vehicles produce pollutants in proportion to the type of energy they use and their efficiency, and I should also add how much they're operated. They're a major contributor to atmospheric pollution in urban areas, and they can have a big impact on health. If you go searching through the literature, you'll find a number of reports from the World Health Organization and others on that health impact of transportation. There are lots of solutions that go from improving efficiency to controlling emissions, to switching energy sources, to making laws, and to designing cities differently. They're all good and should be done. Cultural change is going to happen. They have to happen for that to be implemented, but I think we're moving in that direction. And that's all we have. And here are my two favorite modes of transportation, bicycle, and here's some anonymous British pedestrians out walking in London a few years ago. Anyone recognize this? Old enough people? The cover of Abbey Road. Thank you very much. So that's my talk, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Professor Bahnfleth?
Or comments? Yes, please. Well, I guess they don't want to bring you the mic here.
I should PhD.
Because we recorded, so it's better with
So, Professor, we're talking about electric cars and buses, and we all agree that they can offer cleaner atmospheres in the cities and CO2 reduction, but a key element of these cars is the battery. I'm an engineer, and I know that in order to construct a battery, we need too much energy. And in the end, do we really reduce the CO2 emissions in total? Apart from that, as the number of electric cars rises, we need more electricity generation. So we need, in order to be sustainable, more renewable energy production. What do you think?
I think those are all very valid observations, and particularly the waste problem associated with batteries and the cost of producing them. I think that's an important issue that hasn't been dealt with. But I'm okay with the notion that we're going to need more electricity, because I assume it's going to come from renewable sources. If it doesn't, then it's a huge problem, but it could be a solution to helping balance out the electric supply grid if we have more vehicles. There's usually never anything that doesn't have a downside to it, and it's a good idea to focus on the sorts of things that you were mentioning. The only other thing I'd say is, Yes, but what's the alternative? We keep doing what we're doing. I don't think anyone wants that future either. Get a bike and ride one. I use my car about once every 2 weeks now. I live in a small town that is walkable, rideable. I commute to work on my bicycle. I go shopping for small items, a few at a time, on my bike. If you change your lifestyle a little bit, you find out that you actually don't need these things nearly as much as you thought. In fact, when my daughter graduated from college to go to graduate school, we gave her one of our cars just to see what we could do without it. We've never missed it. And she has a car.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Professor Bahnfleth.
Yeah, thank you very much.